Okay, so we've all heard that saying education is the great equalizer, right? But what if I told you there's a whole field of research out there, dedicated to unpacking that statement and revealing the hidden, machinery behind the scenes? That's what we're diving into today. Critical research in education. And joining me to navigate this super complex topic is our expert. I know you're excited to unpack this as I am.
Absolutely. We're going deep on three articles by Daniel, or Dan Max as he's known in the education world.
Yeah, Dan Mac.
He's head of school at Singapore International School, Chiang Mai, so he's definitely got some frontline insights.
Frontline and outspoken, yeah, from what I've read.
Yeah, definitely.
In his writing, he really emphasizes that critical research isn't just describing what's happening in schools, it's about understanding the power structures and inequalities that shape education. And ultimately, it's about pushing for social justice.
And he uses this great analogy, stratified ontology. Like, imagine reality as a multi-layered cake,
Okay.
with each layer revealing a deeper truth.
I like where this is going.
You've got the frosting, the stuff we see on the surface, like test scores and classroom dynamics. And there's the filling, the events that happen, policy changes, budget cuts, things like that. But critical research takes us to the base layer, the foundation of the cake.
The foundation, huh? Okay, I'm picturing this cake. Now what's in that base layer?
That's where things get really interesting. It's the hidden mechanisms driving everything else. Historical forces, systemic biases, economic disparities, the stuff that's not always visible but has a huge impact. And that's what critical research aims to uncover.
So instead of just saying, oh, there's an achievement gap, it asks, why does this gap exist? What historical and systemic factors have led to this? And how are things structured to keep that gap in place?
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to apply this lens to education specifically. Schools aren't neutral spaces. They reflect the inequalities of society, whether that's funding disparities, biased curricula, or even how discipline is handled.
So this isn't just an academic exercise, right? It has real implications for how we understand and address these challenges. What stands out to you as the most powerful aspect of this approach?
Hmm. For me, it's the focus on connecting those systemic issues to the everyday experiences of students, teachers, and communities. Like, think about the debates we see around college affordability and student loan debt. Critical research helps us understand how education became commodified, treated as a product instead of a public good.
Yeah, that's something a lot of people are grappling with right now, myself included, honestly.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of discipline disparities in schools, how certain groups of students are disproportionately punished. Critical research would look at that through the lens of the school-to-prison pipeline, examining how school policies and practices might be pushing kids down that path. It's not about blaming individuals, it's about uncovering the systemic factors at play.
So even if you're not directly affected by these issues, understanding the systemic perspective can help you see the bigger picture and maybe even challenge your own assumptions.
It's about questioning everything we think we know about education, asking, who benefits from this system? Who is disadvantaged? And how can we create a more just and equitable system for all learners?
It's not about finding easy answers, it's about asking the hard questions, which, yeah, can be uncomfortable.
It can, but that discomfort is often where the most meaningful learning happens. We're forced to confront our own biases, re-examine our beliefs, and to consider alternative perspectives.
And Dan Max isn't shy about tackling these uncomfortable topics. In his work, he brings up some really thought-provoking examples of how these ideas play out in real schools.
He does, yeah. One thing he focuses on is school funding models. He argues that the way we fund schools isn't some neutral system. It's often built on existing power dynamics, where schools in wealthier neighborhoods receive significantly more funding than those in low-income areas.
So it's not just about some schools being good and others being bad. It's about a system that can be inherently unequal from the start.
Precisely. And that's a perfect example of how critical research goes beyond just observing disparities. It helps us understand the historical and political forces that created those disparities.
And what's fascinating is that this applies not just to funding, but to what's actually being taught in classrooms as well.
Absolutely. Dan Max also talks about how curricula can be subtly biased, often reflecting the dominant culture's perspective and leaving out the voices and experiences of marginalized groups. He argues that this can have a profound impact on how students see themselves and their place in the world.
It's like if you're only ever hearing one side of the story, you're missing out on a huge part of history and understanding the world around you.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging, especially for students who don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. It can send the message that their stories don't matter, that their experiences aren't valid.
And that's where the concept of intersectionality comes in, right? It's not enough to just address one form of inequality in isolation. We have to look at how they intersect and impact individuals in complex ways.
Right. And he specifically highlights the experiences of LGBTQ plus students, showing how they often face discrimination and bullying based on both their sexual orientation and gender identity. It's not about treating everyone the same, it's about recognizing and addressing the specific challenges faced by different groups.
It's about equity, not just equality.
Exactly. And this leads us to a really interesting question that Dan Max grapples with in his work. Is all research inherently political?
Now, that's a debate I'm sure a lot of people have strong opinions on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
He makes the argument that even seemingly neutral research can have political impacts. Think about crime statistics. They might seem objective on the surface, but they can be used to justify policies that disproportionately target certain communities, even if those policies are discriminatory.
So even if the research itself isn't intentionally political, the way it's used can have very real political consequences.
Right. And there are two main viewpoints on this. Some argue that all research is inherently political. The questions we ask, who funds the research, how the findings are disseminated, all of it is influenced by power dynamics and ideologies. Others say that while context matters, it's still possible to strive for objectivity, even though their research might be used for political purposes.
So no easy answers there, but it definitely gets us thinking about the complexities of research and the responsibility we have as consumers of that research.
That's a key point. We have a responsibility to be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to something as important as education.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, Dan Matz argues that critical research, by its very nature, is political. It's about challenging power imbalances, fighting for social justice, and advocating for a more equitable education system for all.
So it's not just about understanding the world, it's about changing it, which is, I think, a really powerful message.
It is. And it's a message that can be empowering for students, educators, policymakers, anyone who's passionate about creating a better future for education.
It's about taking that critical lens and applying it to our own experiences, our own communities, and our own roles in shaping the future of education.
Before we dive into some more specific examples of how this plays out, I'm curious, what's standing out to you so far? What are your initial thoughts and reactions to this idea of critical research?
I think what's striking me is how much we just accept as normal in education. We kind of take it for granted that there are going to be good schools and bad schools. But critical research makes you question those labels and look at the systemic reasons behind those differences.
Right, like the example we were talking about with school funding. Dan Max really dives into the specifics of how these funding models can perpetuate those inequalities, even when they're not intentionally designed to do so.
And that brings to mind something else he talks about, the hidden biases in curricula. He says it's not always about outright discrimination, but more like whose stories are being told, whose perspectives are valued, and whose are left out.
He gives a great example. Imagine a history class where the curriculum focuses solely on the achievements of European explorers, without acknowledging the perspectives of the indigenous populations they encountered.
It's like you're getting a very limited, one-sided view of history, which can really shape how you understand the world.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging, especially for students who don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. It can send the message that their stories don't matter, that their experiences aren't valid.
And that's where the concept of intersectionality comes in, right? It's not enough to just address one form of inequality in isolation. We have to look at how they intersect and impact individuals in complex ways.
Dan Max uses the example of LGBTQ plus students who might face discrimination based on both their sexual orientation and their gender identity. They might be dealing with bullying, lack of support from staff, and curriculum that completely ignores their experiences.
It's a reminder that we need to be looking at education through multiple lenses to truly understand the experiences of all students. So all of this is pretty heavy stuff. I'm wondering, are there any examples where critical research has actually led to positive change?
Absolutely, yeah. One area where we're seeing a lot of progress is in inclusive education. Critical research has been instrumental in challenging traditional notions of normalcy and advocating for the rights of students with disabilities to learn alongside their peers.
That's really encouraging. So it's not just about pointing out problems, it's about using research as a tool for advocacy and change.
Exactly. Critical research can help us identify areas where systems are failing students and then provide evidence-based solutions for creating more equitable and inclusive environments.
Now, we can't talk about education today without addressing the role of technology, especially with all the changes we've seen in recent years. How does critical research apply to the digital age?
That's a great question. One of the big issues that critical research highlights is the digital divide. It's not just about having access to devices, it's about having reliable internet access, digital literacy skills, and the ability to use technology effectively for learning.
It's interesting because on the surface, it might seem like technology could be a great equalizer. But critical research helps us see the deeper inequalities that can actually be exacerbated by technology.
Exactly. Students from low-income families, rural communities, or marginalized groups are often at a disadvantage when it comes to technology access and skills. And this can have a huge impact on their educational outcomes.
It's like if you're trying to participate in online learning, but your internet connection is constantly dropping out, or you don't have a quiet space to focus, or you haven't been taught how to use the technology effectively, you're already starting from behind.
Right. And critical research would push us to ask, are we just throwing technology at the problem? Or are we thinking critically about how it's being used and who it's benefiting?
It's about making sure that technology is actually serving as a tool for equity and not just widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Precisely. And that requires us to think about things like providing affordable internet access, offering digital literacy training, and designing educational technology that's accessible to all learners.
So critical research can be a powerful tool for advocating for those types of changes.
Absolutely. And it can also help us be more mindful of the potential unintended consequences of technology. For example, if schools rely too heavily on online learning without providing adequate support, that can actually widen the achievement gap rather than narrow it.
It's not just about the technology itself, it's about how it's used and who it's serving. This reminds me of something we touched on earlier, the question of whether all research is inherently political. It seems like with technology, it can be really easy for personal biases to creep in, even unintentionally.
That's a great observation. Demex talks about how even the algorithms that power educational technology can be biased based on the data they're trained on and the assumptions of the people who create them.
So even something that seems purely technical, like an algorithm, can actually be perpetuating existing inequalities.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to apply a critical lens to all aspects of education, including technology. We can't just assume that because something is new or innovative, that it's automatically going to be equitable or beneficial for all learners.
So it sounds like critical research is really about questioning everything, our assumptions, our biases, the systems we've taken for granted, and using that knowledge to create more just and equitable learning environments for all students.
Got it. It's about recognizing that education has the potential to be a powerful force for social change, but only if we're willing to critically examine its structures and challenge the status quo.
Which I think circles back to something you said earlier, that this work can be uncomfortable, but that's where the real learning happens.
Absolutely. And while we've covered a lot of ground, I think what's important for listeners to take away is that critical research isn't just some abstract academic concept. It's a tool for understanding the world around us, for challenging injustice, and for creating a more equitable society.
It's about asking why, not just what. It's about looking for the root causes, not just the symptoms. And it's about remembering that education has the potential to be a transformative force, but only if we're willing to critically examine its structures and challenge the status quo.
Well said. And I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways from this discussion so far? What's resonating with you?
Honestly, it's a lot to process. On one hand, it's kind of disheartening to realize how many hidden systems are at play, even in something as fundamental as education.
I hear that, yeah. It can feel overwhelming to peel back those layers and see how deeply ingrained some of these inequalities are.
But at the same time, I'm also feeling a sense of hope, because if we can understand these systems, we can start to dismantle them. And critical research gives us the tools to do that.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, as they say. And the more we understand these issues, the better equipped we are to challenge them and advocate for change.
It makes me think about my own role in all of this, right? I'm not a teacher or a policymaker, but I am a parent. And I'm starting to see how I can use this critical lens to have conversations with my kids about the world around them.
That's such an important point. Yeah, it's not just about what happens in schools. It's about the conversations we have at home, in our communities, and in society as a whole.
We can't just assume that kids are going to learn about these issues in school. We have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations with the young people in our lives.
And it's not just about talking to them, it's about listening to their experiences and perspectives. Kids are often on the front lines of these issues, and they have a lot to teach us.
It's about empowering them to be critical thinkers, to question the world around them, and to speak up for what they believe in. So, where do we go from here? If someone wants to learn more about critical research and how to apply it, what are some good resources?
Well, Dan Max's blog is a great starting point. He has tons of articles, research studies, and even some podcasts that dive into these issues in more detail. We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes.
Awesome. And I think beyond reading and listening, it's also about taking action, right? Whether that's advocating for policy changes, supporting organizations that are working to create more equitable education systems, or even just having those tough conversations with friends and family members.
Exactly. It's about taking what we've learned and putting it into practice, and remembering that even small actions can make a difference.
So to wrap things up, if there's one key takeaway we want our listeners to leave with today, what would it be?
I think it's this. Critical research is more than just an academic theory. It's a call to action. It's a challenge to look beyond the surface, to question the systems we've taken for granted, and to work towards creating a more just and equitable education system for all learners.
It's about recognizing that education has the power to transform lives, but only if we're willing to engage in this critical reflection and work towards a more inclusive and equitable future.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder. If, as we've discussed, nothing in the educational system is truly neutral, how does this knowledge change how you view your role? Whether you're a student, a parent, an educator, or simply a member of society, what actions can you take, big or small, to promote equity and challenge injustice in your own sphere of influence?
That's a powerful question to sit with.
It is, and one that we hope will spark continued reflection and action long after this episode is over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic and a new stack of sources to unpack. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world.